Thank you for coming today for our grand opening. This is going to be a day where I'm talking about hypnosis. I'm doing an event at the end where I'm doing a group session. As you kind of can see, I've set up this space uniquely for group hypnosis. The rest of this talk is basically about how hypnosis works. And the way I'm going to explain how hypnosis works might be somewhat different from the way that you might have heard from other practitioners or ways you might have read about in a book, because just like yoga and martial arts and fitness training, every practitioner, especially after a time like 16 years, develops their own understanding and they develop their own style. So you'll kind of hear how I see hypnosis, how I practice hypnosis, and how I would teach hypnosis as well. I think hypnotherapy has a lot of potential as an emerging profession. It's not an established profession. It doesn't have regulation. It's not covered by insurance. It's not an established profession, and we kind of have to recognize that. I think that if hypnotherapists act like, or I would say pretend, that they're an established profession, then the seals and the credentials they put up seem like more than they actually are. If we recognize this is like the first centuries of medicine or the first centuries of dentistry, where we are figuring a lot of things out, and good practitioners doing good work will lead to this being an established profession in the future. I think that's the right way to see it. So a little bit about myself. I'm Luke Chow. I started the Morpheus Clinic for Hypnosis 16 years ago, just down the street. I was 23 years old at the time, and I didn't know I would still be doing hypnotherapy 16 years later, almost at the age of 40. For sure, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life. And I started early enough that I have the potential to really make original contributions, I think, to the field. So this next phase of the Morpheus Clinic for Hypnosis will be much more one-to-many. The pandemic has also normalized live streams and online calls, and generally having more of an international audience. And the English-speaking world is 100 times the size of the GTA. So about 500 million as opposed to 5 million people. So yeah, long story short, I've been doing this for a while. I plan to keep doing this for a while. I'm glad to have you along for the journey. And the slogan I've chosen for my business is "We make hypnosis make sense." Because I think that one thing that's missing from the hypnotherapy world is a sensible understanding of what the heck it is. Without this kind of understanding, a lot of people aren't comfortable beginning hypnotherapy or recommending hypnotherapy. So, if you are an established professional, if you are a family doctor, you'll generally refer to other doctors. You might refer to a physiotherapist, or you might refer to a psychotherapist or a psychologist because they're licensed and they're credentialed and so on. But family doctors very rarely refer to a hypnotherapist. But there's a lot that we can do in the realm of mind-body healing. Essentially, hypnotherapy is a process of teaching our clients ways of thinking that lead to better feelings beneath the neck. That's a one-sentence summary of how I currently understand how hypnosis works for issues like anxiety or IBS or pain management. The thoughts you think in your head are going to make a difference as to how you feel beneath the neck, invariably. The second talk I'm giving later today at 2 o'clock is about the mind-body connection, or I've called it mind-body basics, how to talk to yourself inside your head. So I'll get more into the guts of things you might say to yourself inside your head in order to affect your body positively. But this practice of teaching or learning how to talk to yourself inside your head to make the most of the mind-body connection is not talked about enough of, yet much needed. We have world-class hospitals down the street. Sick Kids and Mount Sinai, Toronto General, they're world-class hospitals. But being positioned where I am, I'm hoping that eventually I'll have researchers coming over, wanting to work with me, wanting to collaborate, with the consent of my clients, looking at my data sets, because I think hypnotherapy has a lot of potential as an emerging profession. If other professions taught their clients how to think to themselves inside their heads in a very straightforward and explicit manner, I would not have a practice. The reason I have a practice is because psychologists and psychotherapists and doctors are not directively and explicitly teaching people, here's what you think to cause better feelings beneath the neck. That is uniquely the niche that hypnotherapists fill. The paradigm that we work under, what I'm going to call the hypnotic paradigm, is that if you give people clear, directive instruction in what to think or how to think, it's the fastest way to helping them compared to the dominant paradigm, which is very influenced by Freud, which is that you have to unravel your past, that you have to look at childhood traumas, that you have to talk about your mother and your father and your upbringing before you change, which can be a multi-year process. That is, in the popular culture, the dominant paradigm. So a lot of the time when I talk about, that you can cause people to quit smoking if they listen carefully for a few hours. You can cause someone to significantly alleviate their IBS symptoms if they listen for a few hours to good ideas to adopt as their own. Sometimes because it doesn't fit into the dominant paradigm, it kind of gets dismissed. And, as you can see physically being here, when people walk by or when people walk in, I think that having a space like this gives hypnotherapy much more credibility. And, I hope to kind of use my platform here, to challenge the dominant paradigm and to say that there is validity in looking at your childhood. There definitely is validity to unraveling your past and understanding how you got to be where you are. There's also validity in setting aside your childhood and learning how someone else might think in your circumstances. I see hypnotherapy as an emerging profession because I think it exists in parallel with and not in opposition to or as a part of other professions. The way I'm directive with my clients, a lot of psychotherapists are not comfortable with. They're kind of trained more to listen, to guide, and not to just straight up tell people what to think. But when people hire me, they want me to tell them just straight up what to think. And it's a missing practice in a lot of the world. Yet when people think hypnotist, that's exactly what they think of. They think of them listening while I speak, and they absorb the thinking that I'm communicating. So this is a profession that stands on its own, in my opinion. It does go against the dominant paradigm, which is that change has to be based on unraveling your past, or that change takes a long time. I'll give you an example. Recently, I had a client, actually I've recently had a few clients, with a fear of flying. The way that many people feel like they have to approach that is that they have to ask themselves and understand how they developed a fear of flying, right? So, if you kind of look back at before you had a fear of flying and then when you developed a fear of flying, and is it related to a fear of death, a fear of heights, a fear of being trapped, and what does that mean? That's sort of the dominant paradigm as to how people overcome a fear of flying. The hypnotic paradigm is that, so I'm a fearless flyer. If you're a fearless flyer, you'll kind of understand this. Flying is boring. It's predictable, it's boring. It doesn't get my heart rate up. So the hypnotic paradigm is that if I have the client listening very carefully to what I'm saying as I express my view of flying while they accept what I'm saying, that is the shortest, most direct route to having them think like a fearless flyer. CBT therapists are not doing this. They're teaching people how to challenge their existing thoughts. They're starting with a problem. Psychodynamic therapists are not doing this. Freudian therapists are not doing this. Only hypnotherapists, as far as I could tell, are so clearly and directively teaching people how to think so that they don't have the problem that they have. It is because the mind-body link is real. So when you tell yourself the plane's going to crash, you're going to be terrified. That's how you create a fearful flyer. If you tell yourself the plane's going to land and it's so predictable you can fall asleep and be just as safe, then you're thinking like a fearless flyer. You're going to be feeling like a fearless flyer. At some point you are a fearless flyer. It's a rather different paradigm than the dominant one. It's also very non-pathologizing. The interesting thing is that because I practice in the way that I do, without pathologizing the client, but seeing them instead as someone who lacks clear instruction in how to think, it seems like this actually works. So I am challenging several dominant paradigms. So you know, the one of psychopathology, the Freudian paradigm, also the biomedical model. I'm challenging all of them at the same time by just straight up teaching people what to think. But it works. So I'll get a little bit more into, I think, the topic you thought I would talk about, which is, you know, like the nitty gritty of how does hypnosis work. I've kind of talked in the big picture about like the paradigm, but I'll talk more about some specifics. So when you see me do a session of hypnotherapy, it looks exactly as you might expect. So the client's sitting in a comfy chair, I'm doing almost all of the talking, the client has their eyes closed, they're relaxed, they're doing the listening. But if you view that scene through the lens of I am teaching them how to think, then it kind of makes sense that in the first 5 or 10 minutes, I'm getting them to turn to their inner world. And for the rest of it, I'm talking so that they hear a thought process unlike their own. And if that thought process is a good one, if that thought process leads a person to have a calmer, happier life, then the client listening so carefully is likely, by adopting that thought process, to have at least a somewhat happier, calmer, better life. The definition of hypnosis, you know, is getting kind of technical, but I'll talk about the definition I use. It's a state of mind where the client has suspended analytical thought or disbelief, and they are instead wholeheartedly listening to what the hypnotist has to say. And it's that wholehearted, careful listening that allows them to absorb and accept what is being said. I think we actually continue a tradition of education and oratory more than we continue a tradition of therapy or medicine. So when I talk about the hypnotic paradigm, it's educational. It's not a paradigm of pathology. It's not a paradigm of remediating. I mean, because it's kind of remediating what they didn't learn earlier in life, but it sees the client not as broken, not as bad, not as diseased, but someone lacking in guidance. Obviously, this excludes some problems from hypnotherapy being likely to have an effect. So obviously, if someone has a medical disorder, it doesn't matter how you think about it. You're going to have the disorder. But in some cases, like I've had a few clients who were dying of cancer. The cancer is real. I can't make that go away. But there's still a way to think about their final months in a way that minimizes suffering. There's a way to think about their final months in a way, alternatively, that adds unnecessary suffering. So even in that situation, there are some things we could do to improve the quality of the client's life within the realm of mindset, attitude, and perspective. So the way hypnosis kind of feels is that it is relaxed, but relaxation doesn't define hypnosis. It describes it, but it doesn't define it. A better definition is what I said earlier, which is suspension of disbelief and wholeheartedly accepting what the hypnotist has to say. But relaxation is another descriptor of what hypnosis feels like. Inward focus is another descriptor. One of the big differences between meditation and hypnosis is that with meditation, there isn't usually someone telling you what to think. Even in guided meditation, they're kind of giving you a process, like breathe in, breathe out, imagine a calm place. But they're not telling you the plane's going to land at the end, right? Usually, the state of mind, being one where analysis is suspended, is it's known as hypersuggestible. So when you suspend your usual defenses that prevent you from accepting new ideas, you then accept new ideas more readily. It's a highly suggestible state of mind. And the one thing we do use is the power of suggestion. A lot of disciplines actually use the power of suggestion, but they credit something else. So a lot of alternative health treatments, are placebos, basically. And placebos are the power of suggestion. So you give someone basically some inert, supplement or pill, and the suggestion is this will alleviate your pain. But that's a nonverbal suggestion. Hypnotherapists might be the only profession that uses the power of suggestion and calls it that. So because we're verbally telling our clients what to think throughout the whole process, we are shamelessly using the power of suggestion and calling it that and not pretending it's something different. Again, I'm making an argument that hypnotherapy as an emerging profession exists in parallel with others, and that it very much has a place, an often underestimated place in the world. With this power of suggestion, we give our clients clear, specific guidance for their inner worlds. I've kind of differentiated it from meditation. I've differentiated hypnosis from psychotherapy as well. Let me just differentiate it from stage hypnosis, which you might have seen. For me, it was my first year of university, where Mike Mandel came and performed a show at U of T. And I kind of watched the show, and I knew a bit about hypnosis at the time. And then and now, I kind of pick out the showmanship as most of the performance, and the hypnotism as part of, but not the entirety of the performance. So here's what you get on stage that you don't get in a private office or in a group setting like this. On stage, you have an audience, and whenever someone is in front of an audience, they do behave differently. You also get the client consenting to and in fact volunteering to entertain that audience. You don't have that in a private office. You don't have that here. So you haven't consented to like squawk like a chicken or bark like a dog or anything, so you're not going to. You're definitely not going to. But if I ask you to volunteer for a show, you have implicitly given your consent to do crazy things on stage. It's a huge difference. And, just like stage magic, it looks like the woman disappears, but actually it's smoke and mirrors. Here, I'm pulling back the smoke screen on stage hypnosis, where you don't see the fact that people implicitly consent to do crazy things just by volunteering. But that is happening. So that explains a lot of it. There's also the fact that there's a selection process happening during a stage hypnosis show. Now, in office, I actually have somewhat of a selection process as well. I try to take on only cases where I believe I can help. In fact, I only take cases where I can write out a treatment plan for the client. But on stage, the selection process usually is that First, they'll assess the audience to see who's suggestible. They'll kind of do a fun exercise with everyone. And some people are going to respond more than others. It's going to be distributed along a bell curve. So most people are just average responders. You get 10 or 15% who are high responders and 10 or 15% who are low responders. We find when we assess our clients here that our clients' suggestibility are distributed along a similar curve. Usually the just occupationally stereotyping. The easiest people to hypnotize are actors. They're highly suggestible. They're very much in tune with their emotions. They have a very good imagination. They can be easily affected by other people's speech. Occupationally it's a stereotype, so it's automatically false, but it's just a stereotype. But the hardest people to hypnotize tends to be the computer programmers, the engineers, and depending on the specialty, often lawyers as well. Because if you're trained to, and then think, if you're trained to think critically and not just to accept what other people have to say, and then you practice that 40 or 60 hours a week, and you've been doing that for 20 years, it's hard to suspend that. Actors suspend that all the time. A lawyer can't just suspend analysis all the time. An engineer, has to build bridges that stay standing. They can't just suspend their analysis all the time. So that's kind of like an occupational stereotype. I've had quite suggestible lawyers. I've also had, people who work in the arts who are not as suggestible. But there is something to the idea of suggestibility. The notion that everyone's a good candidate for hypnotherapy is promoted primarily by professional practitioners, not researchers, and not, I would say, anyone with enough clients that, they can be honest with themselves. That there is such a thing as people for whom hypnotherapy would not be the most recommended practice. It would be the long way around. That's not to say that people who are low in suggestibility can't be hypnotized. Can't is a very strong word. It's that there are some people for whom an approach like CBT makes more sense because we're not asking them to suspend analysis. Here's what to expect if you're being hypnotized. The subjective experience, I'm going to do my best to put into words, because unless you've actually had this experience in real life, the words only approximate what you might be able to expect. If you've been hypnotized, you know what to expect. So one characteristic is an inward focus. So that's why we have people close their eyes. That's why we want a quiet, private space, because we want the client kind of going into their inner worlds, into kind of a reverie. Another characteristic is that it is deeply relaxing. I've had clients tell me that it's more relaxing than massage therapy, which is quite an endorsement, considering I'm not touching the client once. All I'm doing is I'm teaching them what to think to relax themselves. We don't really get instruction in how to relax, right? So once you kind of learn how someone else might sit in a chair and relax for an hour, then you kind of know how to do it, and then you do it for a first time, and then after that, you know for sure you can do it. So there is that deep relaxation, but as I mentioned earlier, relaxation is just one of the effects of hypnosis. It's actually not a defining quality. It's possible to be relaxed without being hypnotized, like when you're relaxing on a beach. It's also to be hypnotized without being relaxed, like on stage, when people volunteer and they pretend that their house is on fire or whatever, they're not relaxed, but they're hypnotized because they're inwardly focused and they've wholeheartedly accepted what the hypnotist had to say. That's why relaxation is not a defining quality, but the suspension of disbelief and wholehearted acceptance of the hypnotist's verbal suggestions, that is the defining quality. You can expect as well the relaxation, or at least some of the relaxation, to linger afterward. So usually for a few days, maybe a few hours after a session, people will sleep better, people will be more relaxed. If people had pain because of muscular tension, it'll be somewhat alleviated. And then, because I'm not the only influence on my client's life or mood or stress levels, usually after a few hours or a few days, the client goes closer to their baseline level of mood or relaxation or confidence or whatever issue we had worked with. But our goal session by session is to improve the baseline. And it is by instilling worldviews and attitudes and perspectives that a confident, secure, relaxed, happy person has. If we're lucky, we got this as children. Few of us are that lucky. Few of us, we all had parents who grew up in the 20th century. The 20th century made a lot of mistakes. The 21st century is making a lot of mistakes. No one does parenting perfectly. And, outside of parenting, there's also school. There's also your peer group. There's also your teachers. There's adverse childhood events that no one wants, but that happens anyway. So, we kind of have a Platonic ideal of what a confident, secure, relaxed, happy person thinks and how they see the world. And as much as I can, when I'm working with a client, I'm communicating to them while they're listening the worldview and the mindset of a secure, confident, relaxed, happy person, so that they can have the gaps left by their childhood filled in once they're adults. For most people, some of what is being suggested will stick long term. So usually after even a first session for someone of average suggestibility, some of what I say will stick long term. Other points need repetition before they kind of wrap their heads around it and then accept it long term. And usually when I'm writing out a treatment plan, I'm writing out just a few points for the client to internalize. They'll vet my points. They'll agree to it. They'll consent to it. And then the sessions, whether it's 3 sessions or 5 sessions, are about instilling that list of bullet points as the client's own thinking. The reason it usually has to be more than one session, the reason it usually is 3 to 5 sessions, is because the first session picks the low-hanging fruit. The second session, kind of reinforces what is sticking and then focuses on what hasn't yet stuck. And by the end of their program, we want all the points I wrote out, plus usually there are new ones that come up as the program progresses, to feel matter of fact. So one example is, as a human being, you have innate worth. Now, this is it's not a universal idea, but in my view, a confident, secure, happy person would believe that a human being, so themselves and others, has innate, inviolable worth because they're human, full stop. Right? So in any hypnosis sessions I do, I'm kind of taking that concept and then I'm putting it into more words so the client can accept it. And some people get that on the first session. Sometimes people need a few repetitions to kind of fully internalize that idea. And the ideas I communicate, I want them to be based in reason and reality. The reason for it is that eventually the client's going to open their eyes and then live their lives in the modern world. It happens that in a first world democracy, the idea that a person has innate worth is the norm, at least in institutions. Sometimes, like in some companies and some households, this idea is not upheld. But generally in the media, in government, in the institutions, we uphold the idea that a person has innate, inviolable worth, full stop. So because I've oriented the client towards something they can see with their own eyes, they don't need too much repetition. They'll watch a Hollywood movie and this idea is reinforced because now they're kind of looking for it and they're noticing it. They'll talk to their friends and neighbors. They'll check out their groceries at the supermarket, and then they'll be recognized as human, and they'll be kind of treated with a basic amount of respect, even if in their household they weren't, even if in their former job they weren't. And the world itself will back up reality-based ideas, which means the client doesn't need to keep hearing them. The ideas that the client keeps needing to hear are the ones that aren't backed up when they open their eyes. So you'll find in the kind of work that I do that I don't like have people flying through forests or imagining waterfalls. It's a nice relaxation exercise in the moment, but it doesn't give them a worldview that is sustainable because you're rarely flying through a forest or walking through a waterfall. But the idea that a person has innate worth that's independent of what other people think, or their income, or their job, or their romantic success, if their worth is independent, once they internalize that idea, it's validated by the world, it sticks with them, it generalizes to many different situations, and it is in line with what I believe a confident, secure, happy person thinks. So that's just one example of the kind of idea that I might instill to get someone to, say I'm working with IBS. Because IBS is so affected by a person's stress levels, the idea that they have inviolable worth, even if they can't make it to a bathroom on time, they still have worth, they still have dignity, they can still hold their heads up high. That is going to reduce their stress levels. So this is a paradigm that I'm not seeing too many professionals subscribe to, where you look at the thinking of an ideal person. The closest is positive psychology. Positive psychologists do kind of look at the mindset of an ideal person and then have people seek to emulate it. But to me, it's not just positive. Again, I use the term reality-based. To kind of recognize that our institutions uphold human dignity and human worth, that's not just positive. That's reality-based. To kind of feel it for yourself and to recognize that people who don't recognize your worth are in the minority, that, again, is reality-based. You can see that with your own eyes. So as much as I can, I'm orienting people toward what they can see with their own eyes, because in my view, that's what causes long-term change. An analogy I'll use is that you probably don't remember who first taught you that 3 times 4 is 12. You don't have to remember who taught you that 3 times 4 is 12. You don't have to revisit the lesson that 3 times 4 is 12. Every time you have 3 rows and 4 columns, you have 12 items, every single time. So the ideas or the principles that I communicate that I think will serve the client the best and that generalizes to situations that I don't have the time to talk about usually on a 5-session timeline, they're going to be the principles that they can repeatedly, dependably see with their own eyes. So that's what I mean by idea sticking long term. I have to make the distinction between suggestions based on fantasy and suggestions that are reality-based. The reality-based suggestions are validated by the world and stick long term. It's the fantasy-based suggestions, or sometimes positive thinking, that often just vanishes when challenged by, when it faces the first major challenge. Here's what not to expect. Hypnosis is not sleep. People who fall asleep do not retain the information they hear. This is why sleep tapes don't work. Used to be in the 1980s, you could buy these language learning tapes that purport to teach you like French or Japanese in your sleep. They don't work. I don't think they're marketed any longer. So people who are asleep don't retain what they hear. Hypnosis is not sleep. If the client falls asleep, I have to wake them up and bring them back into hypnosis. Hypnosis is better described as being half awake and half asleep. So you're aware enough to hear what the hypnotist is saying, but you're also relaxed and inwardly focused enough not to analyze what they're saying too much. That's the sweet spot. If someone is too aware, they might be analyzing what's being said. If someone is actually asleep, they won't retain, they won't even hear, let alone retain what's being said. So the sweet spot is half awake, half asleep. It's enough to suspend disbelief, not so much that the client's actually asleep. Something else not to expect is being mind controlled or being forced to accept ideas against your will. I know that the various intelligence agencies around the world have done experimentation into mind control. Most of it is classified, so I can't really speak to anything I don't know. What I do know is that inside my office, or the office of the average hypnotherapist, we do have to think carefully about the ideas we are communicating, because if the client finds them objectionable, we lose the client and we can't do anything for them. Also, if I give the client a fantasy-based idea, not a reality-based idea, then it's also not going to hold water once they open their eyes. This is why when people leave stage shows, no one goes home believing they're a dog. Even if the stage hypnotist didn't do a great job of restoring the person's humanity, even if they just kind of left them to carry on with life on their own, they don't keep believing they're a dog. At some point, they look in the mirror enough, or they're with friends enough, they know they're human. They fit into a human chair. They can ride a human bicycle. The real life does not back up these fantasy-based suggestions. Real life only backs up reality-based suggestions. You can also expect that it's not a truth serum. Hypnosis does make it easier to accept ideas you wouldn't normally accept. So, if you can trick yourself into speaking a lie, it happens more easily during hypnosis than outside of hypnosis. Hypnosis is not necessarily mystical. It's not supernatural. The idea that hypnosis can help you uncover past lives is promoted primarily by hypnotists who charge money for this. It's not promoted by religious leaders of religions that sincerely believe in reincarnation. Buddhist monks don't tell you to hire your hypnotist to figure out who you were in a past life. Another popular idea that I find doesn't really hold up in practice is the idea that memory recall is significantly improved during hypnosis. In Ontario, when I opened my practice at 15 Elm, it used to be in 2006 that hypnotherapy was not regulated, it still isn't, and psychotherapy wasn't regulated, although it now is. And so back then, hypnotherapists and psychotherapists were legally, at least, on the same footing. So back then, we would do regression. We would kind of take people back into their childhoods, relive past events, try to figure out. I'm talking about age regression, not past life regression. So it's like childhood, not prior to birth in the 1800s. So I've been trained in looking at people's pasts, looking at past memories, and it often turned into a wild goose chase. Because a lot of fears that people have no discernible cause. And if there is no discernible cause of a fear that someone has, and we go looking for it, we're wasting a lot of time. Since psychotherapy became regulated, I've stopped doing age regression. So I've stopped even trying to look for a cause. I'm just leaving it to psychotherapists. I'm trying to, blaze my own path here. And the thing is, it's faster this way. It's faster to straight up tell someone, here's how a fearless person thinks. Here's how a non-smoker thinks. Here's how someone thinks when they take excellent care of themselves. This is faster than trying to figure out how the client got to be the way that they are. And hypnotists who claim that you have to uncover a root cause, and that's like the fastest route or that's the best route, I don't think have enough experience straight up telling people what to think. It's actually harder to be talking almost nonstop for 45 or 50 minutes than to take the client through a step-by-step process and hope they fill in the blanks. So I can kind of see the appeal of taking the client through a step-by-step process and having them fill in the blanks. I used to practice like this. I used to teach like this. But the approach of filling in the blanks for the client is faster. At this point, I've done it both ways. I've had years of experience the first way. I've years of experience the second way. It is faster to fill in the blanks for the clients. I'll talk a little bit about depth, because there's often a question of, whether a client is hypnotized in the first place, let alone how deeply hypnotized they are. Now, depth is a metaphor. Depth is a measure of the unusualness of the idea a client can accept. So a light depth of hypnosis, the client accepts like a somewhat unusual but not too bizarre idea. A deep level of hypnosis has the client accepting a completely bizarre idea like that they're a dog. That's what depth means. It's not depth of relaxation. It's not just like I talked about, someone who believes they're a dog on stage is not necessarily relaxed. But they're deeply hypnotized because they've accepted an idea that's usually quite hard to accept because of its unusualness. So there are different depth scales, and every depth scale is a test or challenge that you give to the client and you see if they accept it. So a popular one is eyelid catalepsy. So it sounds like, relax your eyelids to the point where they don't work. Give them a test. Show yourself your eyelids don't work. That's actually fairly easy to accept. A challenge for a deeper level might be that you've forgotten the number 4. And so you suggest you've forgotten the number 4, you have the client count, and then they'll skip 4, just like their mind blanks out at 4. That's harder to accept than the idea that your eyelids don't work. This is like, I'm not a researcher, but my understanding is that every depth scale is verified in this way. You work with enough people, and you kind of take these tests or challenges, and then you order them in accordance with how hard they are for various people to accept. And if you test for a deeper level, typically you can exhibit phenomena shown at lighter levels. So if relaxation doesn't define hypnosis, how does the client know themselves that they're hypnotized? Right? If they can be not relaxed but hypnotized, then how do they know? Depth testing is also known as convincer strategies within the hypnotherapy world. Because maybe for the hypnotist, it's a depth test. For the client, it's a convincer. It convinces them something's going on other than that they're just listening intellectually. For them to accept their eyelids don't work, they will have had to suspend their disbelief to some degree. For them to believe they've forgotten the number 4, they have to have had suspended their disbelief to some degree. So, you know, in the moment, it feels kind of natural. Just like in a dream, bizarre things feel natural. But afterward, the dream feels bizarre. Afterward, you can point out that they don't normally just kind of forget the next number in a sequence. So that's kind of one way of objectively measuring hypnosis and kind of having the client recognize in a more objective manner than just how they feel if they were really hypnotized. The one hypnotic phenomenon that's so dependable that without it, I consider the client not to have been really hypnotized, is called time distortion. So this happens during hypnosis. It sometimes happens outside hypnosis, but in hypnosis, it dependably happens, where a 50-minute session typically feels subjectively like it might only be 15 minutes. So if I'm doing a session and then afterward the client reports they feel like they just listened to me lecture for 50 minutes, I think they weren't really hypnotized. If I did talk for 50 minutes and they wonder where all the time went, if they, they'll have heard everything, but yet they'll subjectively estimate time to have flown by, that tells me that they were hypnotized. One concept that I want to talk about is the hypnotic contract. This is one of those invisible dynamics happening between the hypnotist and the client that you see once it's pointed out, but that you might not see unless it's pointed out. So I talked about people volunteering for a stage hypnosis show, giving their consent to do crazy things. That's an example of the hypnotic contract. It's that the hypnotist is going to put on an entertaining show, and that's kind of how the hypnotist fulfills their side of the contract. And the client or the volunteer in that situation, they're going to, do what the hypnotist says and trust that they're going to get laughter from the audience. So that's the agreement between the stage hypnotist and their volunteers, that they're each going to play those roles. And, that means people are not going to volunteer and, be physically hurt, for example. And they're not going to volunteer and then refuse to act like they're a dog. In a private office like mine, the hypnotic contract, I do written treatment plans, so that's kind of more like a formal kind of contract. But in my office, the implicit agreement is that I'm going to do everything I can using my experience and my knowledge and my thought processes to help the client accept helpful ways of thinking. And the client is then going to suspend disbelief and listen wholeheartedly. So if I indicate that I don't have the client's best interest in mind, I don't even expect the client to suspend disbelief. Their suspension of disbelief goes hand in hand with me looking out for the client's best interests. If I'm not looking out for their best interests, I don't expect them to walk in at all. So it's an implicit, invisible kind of contract or agreement, but that is happening invisibly between any hypnotist and their client. Whenever you see a hypnotist speak and the client respond immediately, it's because the hypnotic contract has been established. Now, this concept comes from Gerald Kine, as far as I know, just to give credit where credit is due. He passed away a few years ago. But as far as I know, he was the originator of this conceptualization of the relationship between hypnotist and client as a kind of contract. Briefly, things that hypnosis can and cannot help with. Hypnosis can help with any issue or problem that's within the realm of thought or attitude or perspective or worldview. So if someone else is in your situation and they're suffering less because they think about it differently, hypnosis can probably help. because we just had to model the healthy thought process and communicate that thought process to our client. If the client's problem is outside the realm of that which can be helped by a change in attitude or perspective, hypnosis probably can't help. So that's a simple filter for figuring out whether hypnosis can help or not. We must, however, acknowledge the mind-body link. Something like IBS, for example, is not just physical. There's a very strong emotional component, it seems, to IBS, where the person suffering from IBS who's in a better mood is going to suffer less physically, like in terms of churning or bloating. They're going to suffer less than if they had a lot of stress or anxiety. So the next talk I'm giving at 2 o'clock is about mind-body basics, how to talk to yourself inside your head. Risks. So this has to come up, risks of hypnosis, because just like professional hypnotists sometimes suggest that everyone can be hypnotized for business reasons, sometimes they suggest hypnosis is perfectly safe for business reasons. And anything that is completely safe is also completely ineffective. Even water can drown you if you are in too much of it. So, a knife can cut both ways. A power drill can build or harm. Everything with an effect, especially everything with a strong effect, used irresponsibly, can hurt. I believe in practicing in a risk-aware way rather than pretending that there are no risks. So I'm going to talk a bit about risks. The risks are actually not huge. I think a yoga class has more risks because of the physicality, or like a martial arts dojo where they teach you to punch each other. Like that has more risk than something like hypnotherapy. But to say it is completely safe is, I think, to practice irresponsibly. I think that a responsible practitioner has to be aware of where the risks are so that they don't put clients at potential risk. So one obvious one is that right after hypnosis, people are very contemplative. So, if the hypnotist did a good job, they took the client through their inner world, gave them new perspectives, and the client's kind of, very thoughtful and contemplative afterward, and that's not a good state of mind to be in when driving. So it's not recognized as being like drinking and driving, but hypnosis does alter your consciousness. It can take a little bit of time afterward to be fully aware and alert again after hypnosis, just like it can take a little bit of time to be aware and alert after meditation, or after watching a really good play, or after attending a concert. People kind of want to, walk off the relaxation and let things settle and process for a bit before they drive a car. So that's just one, potential. It's a potential for physical injury that we want to talk about. The greatest risk, in my view, and I disagree with a lot of practitioners in this regard, but the greatest risk, in my view, is communicating thought processes or ideas that are just not helpful. People don't need hypnosis to accept bad ideas. I'll give you an example of a bad idea. Sleep is for the weak. Bad idea. People who internalize the idea that sleep is for the weak and you don't need sleep, they compromise the quality of their lives. Conversely, people who internalize the idea that sleep is an entitlement. You're alive. You need sleep. It's an entitlement. Get the best quality sleep you can. That's going to create a higher quality of life. So there is such a thing as a bad idea. I am going to say, not all ideas are equally good. There is such a thing as bad ways of thinking that harm people who adopt those ways of thinking. Another idea that I would pinpoint as a bad idea that's very popular is that we should work like machines, right? That, like at work, we should be machines. We have to meet specification to earn our salary, right? But, like if you would let your sled dog or your draft horse rest, if you would take good care of your horse and your dog, despite them having a job on the farm, if you recognize that life has needs that your tractor doesn't, compare yourself to the animal, not to the tractor. So the worldview that I'm challenging is that we're like objects as opposed to that we're like life. If you kind of see yourself as like an object, and if you have problems, a defective object, it reduces the quality of your life. If you categorize yourself incorrectly as life, the rules are different. How we treat even a house plant is different from how we treat our chair. Our chair, we can toss out when it's served its useful life. You can leave it neglected when you go on vacation without consequence. A house plant, you'll try to take care of and make its life as good as you can make it. A house plant cannot be neglected when you go on vacation without consequence. So the point I want to make is that there is such a thing as a bad idea. Hypnosis is a highly suggestible state of mind. It makes it easier to accept bad ideas when communicated, and unfortunately, a lot of these bad ideas are backed up by one's employer, or one's neighbors, or one's parents. So you'll find a lot of support for the idea that we're like objects and machines. If the hypnotist is backing up this idea, in my view, they are causing harm to their client. Because no human being is correctly categorized as an object. We're among living beings. That's where we belong. That's us. That's truth. That's the reality-based view. So the risks involved, in my view, and I'm not sure anyone else is really talking about it like this, but that's why the YouTube videos and everything. The risks are that not all ideas are healthy or helpful. And, if we are going to purport to be in the practice of improving people's thinking, which is how I see my work, if we're in the profession of improving people's thinking and people then trust us and then put themselves in our hands, then we better make sure we are improving their thinking with the thinking that we are verbalizing while they are in a suggestible and vulnerable state. So that's my message to hypnotists who say that hypnosis is perfectly safe. Practicing in a risk-aware manner, thinking through what you communicate is how I practice. I'm fairly successful doing it like this. You don't have to pretend it's perfectly safe. Sometimes when the topic of hypnosis comes up, the question of the unconscious or the subconscious mind will come up. It's very Freudian, and that there is truth to the idea that we aren't aware or conscious of every process that happens inside our heads. My heart's beating on its own, my lungs are breathing, even though I'm not thinking about my heartbeat or my breathing. There's a lot going on that is outside of my narrow band of awareness. This I acknowledge. An idea I would challenge is that I can speak with any authority at all about all that is outside of my awareness. So while I acknowledge that there are unconscious processes happening in my body, happening inside my head, happening with my emotions, there are associations where I see a certain thing and then I feel a certain feeling automatically. That does happen. I also won't speak with any authority about what the unconscious mind wants or what it does or how it works or what's inside it. People who speak with authority on this topic strike me as kind of like they're peering into a completely dark room and speaking with confidence about what's inside. I'd rather just acknowledge it's a dark room and leave it at that. Prior to me talking about the topic right now, you haven't heard me use the word unconscious or subconscious once. And yet, I believe I've explained hypnotherapy quite well, nonetheless. We don't actually need a concept of the unconscious mind to do hypnotherapy. In fact, Mesmer existed long before Freud. He was basically doing hypnosis without any concept of the unconscious mind. Modern day hypnotists also don't need a concept of the unconscious mind.